Welcome. In this video, I'll be giving you a brief introduction to cakes and frostings from Chapter 35 of your On Cooking textbook. There are many different ingredients that go into making cakes, but certain ingredients have a unique effect on the cakes. So I've categorized them a little differently for you. Flour, milk, and eggs all act as products that toughen your cake. So the more flour there is, the more milk, the more eggs, the more you have to be precautious about your cake being too tough. Versus something like a tenderizer. Too much sugar, too much fat, too much egg yolks will cause it to be too tender, in which case you might not be able to establish enough gluten. Then you have those that add moisture to your cake. Could be water, milk, juice, eggs. I've tried something like coffee before. However, it's extracted most of the moisture out of the cake instead of actually adding any into it. So be careful on what liquid ingredients you're adding in there. There are ingredients that just dry out your cake. Again, too much flour, too much starch, milk solids. Too many milk solids will cause it again to become more of a drier product. And then there's leavener agents. So our air and our steam is going to be important with things such as our high-fat cakes that we'll talk about in a moment. Eggs are going to be our main leavener for our egg foam cakes, and sometimes chemical leaveners are used with cakes as well. And then there, of course, are an endless variety of flavorings in forms of extracts, just adding straight chocolate, any version of chocolate, as well as different spices, adding some butter and other fats in there, adding some acids. Lemon is extremely popular, just to bring out some natural flavor in some of your cakes. The goal when mixing your cake is to combine all of the ingredients well. Generally, you're going to want to incorporate air, and really you're looking to develop that proper texture. Each cake is going to have a different crumb, which refers to the actual texture, the way that it feels in your mouth. But then we will have other components that we're comparing as well. So the high-fat cakes or egg foam cakes would be the main two categories if we had to separate the mixing methods. The high-fat cakes that we'll talk about here first really is where you're involving the creaming method. You're taking the fat and the sugar and creaming that together, incorporating air. So we'll specifically talk about our butter cakes and high-ratio cakes here in just a moment. Our egg foam cakes then are just that, cakes that are built on the structure of air being incorporated into those eggs. So we have a Jinhua, a sponge cake, an angel food cake, and chiffons that we will talk about. First, we'll talk about your butter cakes. Your most common would be your pound cake. Your pound cakes have a high amount of fat and usually involve a chemical leavener to help them rise. They have more of a fine grain, and they definitely have some moistness to it because of all of that fat in there. They tend to have more of a thin and tender crust, meaning the outside brown part there. However, I find in all pound cakes that I've made, it tends to have an even darker crust and a little bit more developed in order to fully be able to cook all the way through. But the basic procedure is creaming your fat and sugar together, adding your eggs in usually one at a time so they slowly incorporate, and then alternate between your dry and your wet ingredients. Then you're going to get your pan ready, incorporate your batter into the pan, and then bake it. The other main method of making high-fat cakes is a high-ratio cake. A high-ratio cake really refers to the idea that there's a large amount of sugar and liquid in the recipe in proportion, in ratio terms to the flour. We need to use emulsified shortening with our high-ratio cakes. Emulsified shortening is one that can really trap the high amount of sugar and the high amount of liquid together to keep that air within that and then incorporate throughout the rest of the ingredients. Because there are so many liquids, or a large proportion of liquids in these cakes, the liquids then are added in two different steps in this method, so it's often referred to as a two-stage method. It generally has a very fine grain on it. It tends to be pretty moist and has a good rise on it. This would be in comparison to any pre-made mix, like a box mix cake that you would make. This would be very similar to the texture that you could expect from that. So your basic procedure for your high ratio cake, is blending all your dry ingredients together with your shortening. Then you add half of the liquid, blend it some more, definitely scraping the sides, and then you add the rest of the liquid and continue to blend it till it's well incorporated. Now we're not trying to develop a whole lot of gluten here, so generally we're going to be using a cake flour, but we still want to make sure that we do develop some gluten by blending all of the ingredients well. We're going to pan it and then bake it, just as with the pound cake before. Moving into our egg foam cakes, we'll start with our Jinhua. A Jinhua incorporates whole eggs together. You add some of the sugar in with those eggs. It helps to stabilize and allow it to incorporate a good bit of air. There's no chemical leaveners generally with the Jinhua, so it really is relying on that air that's going to be incorporated into those eggs. Sometimes you'll add a little oil or butter to the batter, usually towards the end there, just to shorten the gluten a little bit so that it becomes a more tender product. But it usually is going to be dry. It's going to be spongy. And making a simple syrup with equal parts water and sugar, letting that melt down, and then glazing the top of it and really letting some of that soak into this cake is going to be important to add some extra moisture. And you could incorporate different flavors with it as well. The basic procedure for this is sifting all the dry ingredients together, again getting rid of all those lumps and incorporating air as much as you can. Combine all your eggs and sugar and then heat them over a double boiler or a water bath, so that way it is heating up gently by that steam. You really want to heat it up to about 100 degrees, as these eggs are going to incorporate air a lot better as they're warmed. So you're going to whip them until they're about tripled in size. Then fold in those dry ingredients. Lastly, we're going to add in that fat, and then we'll pan it and bake it. Again, this really relies on the actual air incorporated into the egg here. So it's important that when we pan it, that we do not grease the sides of the pan to allow for it to cling to it as it rises. Next, we'll talk about a sponge cake, which is very close to a Jinhua. In fact, a lot of different recipes will call their cake a Jinhua sponge cake. But they are different. A Jinhua, remember, we took the whole eggs together. Here in the sponge cake, we're separating the eggs. The yolks we will incorporate into the batter, but the whites are going to be whipped separately and folded in. It tends to be a much moister and more tender product. These are very popular for making jelly rolls or pumpkin rolls, as they really yield to being maneuvered and manipulated around. As you can see in the picture here, it's great to slice and be able to make multi-layered cakes, or eat as is. The basic procedure includes you sifting the dry ingredients with some of the sugar, because you're going to be adding a lot more of the sugar then to both the yolks and the whites, as long as all the sugar is incorporated. So I'm going to whip the yolks and the sugar just till it's about a ribbon stage, meaning that it's a lighter pale yellow color, and that if I pulled the whisk out of the batter, it would leave like a ribbon kind of resting on top, meaning it's a little bit thicker there. Whip the egg whites separately, again with some sugar to really stabilize and kind of hold that stability there. And then you'll fold them together and fold in the dry ingredients. Here then you're going to go ahead and pan and bake. Moving on to our angel food cakes. Angel food cakes are an extremely popular choice because they're low in fat. Actually, they have no fat at all. However, there is still a large amount of sugar in this cake. The cake mainly is leavened with the whipped egg whites, in that the air is trapped within them. It is important not to spray the pan, so again, it can cling up the side as it's baking and help it to rise, turning into this light, fluffy, delicious cake. The basic procedure involves sifting all the dry ingredients with some of the sugar, because again, you want to add some of the sugar to the whipped egg whites for that stability. You fold the two together and immediately will pan. And then once you bake it and pull it out to cool, you will invert it. You'll notice in the picture on the bottom here, most pans will come with the little prongs, little feet there, that you could just invert the pan itself and let it sit on the countertop. Or you could get crazy and stick it on a bottle and let it sit up in the air so that it can cool down a lot better, having that air circulate all the way around. Whichever method, make sure that you have it inverted. That way the cake doesn't flop back down. Again, you want it to be light and airy, and right now there's not a whole lot keeping it stable. So by turning it upside down, it's stuck in that pan and will cool in that texture and in that shape. Next, we'll talk about our chiffon cakes, which are really similar to the angel food cakes, but they do have the yolk and they have some oil in them, so we're not talking about a non-fat cake anymore. It tends to be a much moister and richer cake, and sometimes has a chemical leavener in it just to help it as well for that rising power. The basic procedure is sifting your dry ingredients, adding all your liquids, including your oil, all at one time, whipping your egg whites with a little bit of that sugar and folding it in. So we're still whipping our egg whites, but our yolks again are part of the batter. We're going to pan and bake it, and again cool it inverted to make sure that it can maintain that structure. I've mentioned a couple times about pan preparations, and there's just about as many ways to prepare your pans as there are pans available. Pans come in all sizes and shapes and with different coatings. Really, the two to key in on are the angel food cake and the chiffon cake. You want to make sure that you're not greasing those pans, and I've stressed how that batter needs to cling to the sides as it rises. Other ones, you want to make sure the sides aren't greased, like for the Jinhua. You want to have the bottom lined, but you want it to be able to, again, somewhat cling to the side, in which case you'll just run a knife around the outside edge before you remove it. You definitely want to grease and line, meaning take a piece of parchment paper, as in the bottom right here, and place it around the bottom. You can put your pan right on top of the parchment paper and trace it and then cut it out if you want to make sure that you get an exact size. I prefer to spray my pan, grease my pan on the sides first, and then place my parchment paper circle to ensure that the edges are completely greased. If just a little bit of the cake will stick to it, it could tear my entire cake apart as I am taking it out of the pan. You'll notice in the picture in the middle here, this is dusting it with flour. It's important after you've greased it to dust with flour. For some of your high-fat cakes, definitely your chocolate cakes, any cakes that might have fruit chunks or purees in it, and make sure you have an extra layer of flour there to help it from not sticking. However, make sure you don't have too much flour clumped on it. Give it a couple taps and make sure that you have removed any of the excess. In regards to filling pans, generally you want to fill them about 2/3 of the way full. If you're making a lot of different cakes with one batter, you'd want to separate and make sure that they are evenly proportioned. You can do this by weighing it. You could use a balance scale to make sure that you're separating the batter evenly between, let's say, 2 pans, or you can have on your measurement or on your recipe that it's 1 quart for this size pan, and you could measure it with a liquid measure. There are a lot of charts available too to give you an idea of weight and volume measure for what size pan that you're working with. I prefer to do one cake pan that is a little fuller. That way, as you can see, as I have a little rise on it, I will be able to level it off, just as you see in the picture of the back bottom here, with a cake that's completely leveled, and that way I can minimize my crumbs as well. This is great if I want to add a simple syrup or any flavor. Having this exposed layer of cake here, it will absorb a lot easier. In regards to baking, before you bake any of your high-fat cakes, that's very important. You do not want to do this to an egg foam cake. You've just incorporated all that air into cakes. You certainly would not want to tap all the air out, but your high-fat cakes, you would. You want to get rid of all those air bubbles. When you're baking, you're looking anywhere between 325 and 375 degrees Fahrenheit. But if you're doing a large sheet tray that is thin, like a sponge cake, for a jelly roll, you want to make sure that you're doing maybe a 375 because it's going to be a shorter amount of time. However, if you're doing a very thick, 12-inch round cake, you want to make sure that it's 325. You give it more time to bake and you lower that temperature. Don't disturb it once you've put it in the oven. You'll lose steam, as well as some of those gases could deflate out. There's not a whole lot of gluten here, so you want to let it be. Put it in the center rack if possible, where it's not going to be disturbed and it's going to be evenly heated all the way throughout. As far as determining when your cake is done, certainly you could look at your recipe for the time, yet all ovens are going to be different. Really, the appearance of it and touching the center there and making sure that it springs back is best. You could use a cake tester or a toothpick as well. And then cooling. After about 10-15 minutes, it's important to take it out of the pan and remove that parchment paper. Storing at room temperature till fully cooled. Wrapped and stored at room temperature or for longer, can be stored in the freezer.